Yeah, nice to meet you, everybody. I'm Ross. I'm founder, CEO, Chief Scientific Officer of a company called Ultromics, which is an AI company that builds medical devices for diagnosis of different heart diseases. Prior to Ultromics, I was a trainee in the NHS as a cardiac physiologist, specializing in echocardiography. I've kind of a broad-based scientific background, which is kind of synonymous with not really knowing what I wanted to do. So I started in zoology, went into clinical biochemistry, went into clinical cardiovascular imaging, which then led me to my clinical training. I then did a PhD in cardiovascular medicine at Oxford, which was kind of a fusion of clinical imaging and artificial intelligence. That's kind of my background. Also, the reason I'm here is I live approximately 10 minutes down the road. So my business is Ultromics is based in the US and the UK. But my wife and I decided to move back about 8 years ago, right before Ultromics spun out. We didn't know it was actually going to become a business. We held no faith that it was going to succeed. So we decided to come back to Sussex and raise a family. But Ultromics did end up taking off, and I've had a fairly long commute ever since we made that decision. Alongside my roles at Ultromics, I still a researcher and supervise PhD students at Oxford University. And I also have a research role with the NIH as well. So this talk is going to be about how, my research and our research in academia kind of translated to a company, to a health tech venture. And hopefully the idea is I can walk you through the journey. It's going to be steeped in the medical field, but hopefully the broad principles are, you can extrapolate them to the areas of your interest. So for me, it started in the Echo Lab. This is where I had the kind of initial idea. And for those that don't know what an echo is, or a cardiac ultrasound looks like, it's this horrible grainy image here you can see. There's approximately, within, 4 or 5 cardiac cycles, there's approximately 14 million pixels that are available within that image. And when I started practicing, echo was largely qualitative. You would look at the image, you'd look at the video of the heart beating, and you would try to arrive at a diagnosis. You would also make some manual measurements and say the heart looks big, or the heart doesn't look like it's pumping very well. It was quite manual in its approach. And what happened was we ended up missing a lot of disease. We misdiagnosed disease, and patients would end up coming into the ER. This particular echocardiogram is not, it looks fairly normal. I've put the measurements up there just for illustrative purposes, but essentially what those measurements are saying is this echo is relatively normal from a functional perspective. If you were to look at the echo, it doesn't look particularly, nothing stands out as a massive feature in there that would say this patient has severe disease. If there's anyone clinical in the audience, you would potentially look at it. They may have a thickened wall, they may have an enlarged atria, but generally speaking, there's nothing like hugely alarming about this echo. And I want you to remember that, because I'm going to revisit it right at the end as my last slide on the presentation. So it was around 2014, 2015, where I started the PhD, which was AI cross echocardiography. My first kind of idea and thought was, firstly, it really helped practicing clinically, because I was able to see the shortcomings of the diagnosis. I was able to see the patients coming into clinic. I was able to see what we were missing clinically. We would do a weekly review with my professor and find out which patients we'd missed or in terms of diagnosis. And so my first kind of thought was, well, I wonder if we can measure more things, right? We only make a few measurements. I wonder if we can take concepts from elsewhere and measure them in echo, and will that help us with the diagnosis? The first idea we had of that was taking a principle from kind of continuum mechanics and structural engineering, which was something called principal strain, or the principal stress vector, which is where you look at a building like this building, you try and find the vector of maximum stress, and you go, that's the point that the building's going to fail if we were to have an earthquake. And we took that same principle and applied it to the heart and tried to measure the vector of maximal stress and where the heart would fail if there was disease present, essentially. And that's kind of one of the first things we did. It led to this abstract, and we pulled out many more features from this using that kind of principle, and actually turned out to be quite a good diagnostic feature of the echo. And so we pulled out, I don't know, 200, maybe more features similar to that to try and improve the diagnosis. The next thing we did was try to characterize the heart's geometry in a more complex way to see if that would give us any clues as to diagnosis or disease. And we actually did this in preterm born infants, and we found some novel findings in that. But the features we generated were really interesting, and it shows that we could characterize the heart in a more novel geometric way. So we were left with a few hundred features that were both describe the heart functionally in a way that's never been described before, but also geometrically in the way the heart's never been described before. And so we thought, we're kind of trying to think about which disease to apply this to. We knew we obviously wanted to be a cardiac disease, but we thought, what's the best disease to apply this technology to? So we revisited our clinical experience, and the one that was often missed in clinic that we were seeing was coronary artery disease. So we approximated that about 25 to 30% of cases coming through echo clinic were missed. And so that is the disease we ultimately end up trying to tackle here. We had this theory of this kind of diagnostic triangle, if you like, and it's quite true today. You still use it as it was back then, which is you want to find a disease that's underdetected, number one. Number two, that underdetection has got to lead to a problem, i.e. hospitalizations or increased mortality. And number three, that disease should have a therapy that can fix the problem, that can reduce hospitalizations, that can reduce mortality. So that's the triangle we operated in terms of what would be useful clinically to build. And we still use that triangle today. And so we wanted to use these novel features that we created in combination with machine learning to assemble them into a diagnostic tree or diagnostic pattern that helps enable us diagnose coronary artery disease more. And so we started the Everest study back in 2015, which was recruiting lots of coronary artery disease patients across the NHS. And then we built what will look like a very old school AI pipeline these days to generate our first diagnostic machine learning classifier. And that involved firstly defining the region of interest in the image using a contour, and we used a neural network to do that. We then had a feature extraction engine which extracted all the features I spoke about a couple of slides ago. We fed all these features into what was an ensemble supervised machine learning classifier back then, and then we obviously validate it in an independent testing population. You'll notice, I mean, bear in mind this was 2014, 2015, the patient population size back then was very small versus the kinds of numbers we see now. I think it's perhaps a reflection of how far AI has come in the last decade. That would, if I went to a health tech investor with those numbers now, I think I'd get laughed out of the room. But that was that was decent back then in this field. So once we did this proof of concept, I actually presented this at a conference in Oxford, and they had some of their tech transfer people there. Oxford University had some of their tech transfer people there, and they suggested that this is potentially commercially attractive, and have I ever thought about turning this into a business? And I hadn't. We were trying to do this for research. It was never my intention to spin Ultromics out. I never saw myself as an entrepreneur or even a CEO. I still don't really. But we were intrigued by the prospect of potentially getting this, into the real world. And it would have been easy for us just to publish this and for it to sit and do nothing. But we actually thought, let's see if we can get this out into the real world and get this and run patients through this. So we decided to go through with it. We were fortunate enough to receive some initial startup funding through the Oxford University program, and that enabled us to contract software developers to build a prototype, of which I've screenshotted that there. You don't have to do that these days. You can just go to ChatGPT and build it yourself. But back then it required some money and some software contractors. So 2017 was when we spun out Ultromics, so about 8 years ago. What did we need for an outside investor to give us money to turn this into a company? Well, the first is you need a well-articulated problem and a vision to solving that problem. I would say is probably the most important point. And a part of that is the investors have to believe that you are uniquely positioned as an individual to solve that problem. So what is it about you that is well positioned to solve that problem? So you have your problem statement, i.e. coronary artery disease is massively underdiagnosed, and you have a vision to solving that problem. You have to have these are not rules, by the way. This is just what we had, so don't take them as absolute guidelines. But one of the things we had was a working prototype, so we could actually bring the vision to life a little bit, show investors how visually it might work, and that was quite powerful. And I think that's an important thing to have. A very high-level commercial plan with a big total addressable market, or TAM. Looking back on that today, that was utter nonsense what we put in front of investors back then. We had no idea how hard it was to scale the company. I think we had us going to 100 million in like 3 years or something ridiculous, which never happened, was never going to happen. And we know that now. But you need some sort of way of showing that you can execute a commercial plan. And that plan has to have a big enough total addressable market. And what I mean by that is investors tend to invest in things if they think that it can be big enough and deliver like 10x, 20x returns at that stage. So if you were to go to them and say your total market for this product is about 10 million, it's probably not going to get, ambitious investors involved. If you say, the total addressable market of this product is 1 billion or 5 billion, then you're probably more likely to attract some ambitious investors. And things like heart disease do attract that kind of number if because it's so common, so voluminous, and causes such big healthcare burden, you can build a market around that value. You also have to have some good validation results. So they don't need to be, full external clinical trials yet, but just some good early validation results. And importantly, you have to have a key opinion leader that isn't you, that's in the field, that says this technology could solve a problem that I'm currently dealing with, and I support it. It's important to have that. It can't just be you saying, this is going to be the next best thing. You have to have people involved in the area. This was our incorporation date. We got some seed funding, thankfully, from our local investors in Oxford, and we incorporated the company in March of 2017. I think we actually spun the company out close to or on my honeymoon. So my wife was very that was kind of a sign of things to come, right? When you go into this line of work, you have to kind of realize that you're going to be very busy and have to spend time outside of working hours to deliver. So what did we do with the seed money? So we had initial seed funding. First things first is we had to map out the landscape and figure out how we're going to deliver this product. So what we had kind of prototyped was the end bit here, which is the diagnostics, the bit that's highlighted in blue. However, there's an entire pipeline that happens before it gets to your AI device. And you either have to work with those people or build it yourself. And figuring that out in terms of how you actually get your solution to the end customer is really important. So we did a lot of this work in the seed stage. So in Echo, you have the hardware, so the actual machines that acquire the ultrasound videos. You have quality and guidance systems that help standardize the image acquisition. You have where the images are stored, which are called the PAC systems in the hospitals. Then you have to sort the images, you have to quantify the images, and then you get to the diagnostics. So you have to figure out what you're going to build and who you're going to work with. We were never going to build a fully fledged hardware machine, so we knew that our software had to work with all of these players. We were never going to build a storage system for images because hospitals have large storage systems that are hard to replace. They're billion-dollar contracts. We're not going to come along and replace their storage systems. So we knew we had to take over from the image sorting bit onwards and build that software pipeline. And this is a very high level overview of the AI pipeline we built to kind of solve that problem. So initially, we have a convolutional neural network applied to sorting the views and classifying the views. Just as an example, when you do an ultrasound on a patient, you typically take 50 to 70 different views. So you have to tell the AI what view is what and which view needs to be fed through to the end result. So you have to be able to label them all. So we built a classifier to do that. CNN. You then have to define the region of interest, as mentioned. That was done with a 3D neural network. And you have to track that region of interest through the cardiac cycle, through time. Then you extract your features, and then finally it's fed into the disease detection. Most of our seed stage funding, most of the 2 years, was building that in a robust platform that is kind of clinical grade software and outside of research code and Python, because a lot of things break in Python, and FDA don't particularly like Python. Regulatory bodies don't particularly like that kind of code base. You have to put it in a more robust code base. The majority of our 2 years spent building that. The other part of our seed stage was actually externally validating the algorithm. So we did a study with some US and UK based hospitals to validate the algorithm, which we eventually published. And interestingly, what we saw was, it was good performance, right? We achieved 93% accuracy. I think the clinical standard at that time was about 76% accuracy. But then when we actually gave it to readers, cardiologists to use, and did a reader study, we showed that on average, we improved cardiologists by 5%. But interestingly, we improved the lesser experienced cardiologists way more than we improved the more experienced cardiologists who had minimal gain. And that's kind of what we showed in the paper. And that was enough to progress to the next funding round. So that's kind of the proof points that we delivered initially after our seed stage. We built the pipeline and we validated the technology externally. Next came Series A, which is, if you're not familiar, these are just the standard terms of fundraising. You have seed stage, Series A, Series B, Series C, and progressively, the idea is the company gets bigger and bigger and bigger. However, most companies don't get past seed stage. So often there's a big graveyard between seed and Series A and Series B. So what did we need to get the Series A funding? Well, we needed that external validation done, which we did. We needed the end-to-end software pipeline built. Because we had done the trial results, we also had a path to regulatory clearance, so we can actually start selling the software. We hadn't got FDA clearance yet, but we'd spoken to them, we'd done the trial, so we were in good shape. And once you have line of sight to clearance, you also have line of sight to generating your first revenue. And lastly, what you have to have is a way to distribute your model. So how are you going to get your AI product into the hands of customers, which in this case is cardiologists? So with our Series A money, we actually focused on building the distribution platform. How are we going to deliver this product and get it into the hands of cardiologists? This is again, a very high level overview of the schematic for how we distribute the software. What happens is all the echoes are done on those big machines, as you saw earlier. Those echoes get stored in a PACS system. We built a VPN connection into these hospital PACS systems here in the UK and also in the US. And we pull all the echo studies from that PACS system into our cloud, where our AI model and AI pipeline sits. Those studies automatically run through the pipeline, and then the results from the reports are sent back through the VPN connection and back into the hospital PACS system. We designed it to work in less than 15 minutes because you really want the report to be in the PACS system by the time the cardiologist starts reporting on the study. You don't have to come back to the study afterwards, so we know we needed it to be quite quick. And so that's what we designed. That's a very simple overview for something that took essentially 4 years to build. It was very difficult to do because it has to have all the data privacy and all the IT security compliance with it as well. So this was not an easy thing. A lot of people and a lot of companies don't do this bit. They would alternatively partner with someone who could, like, they would put their app on an ultrasound machine, for example. We decided not to do that because we knew the AI models were going to be quite heavy. They probably wouldn't run well on the machine. We also wanted to build multiple models. We didn't want to just build one. So we didn't want to be limited to running on, you know, CPUs on a machine. And with the Series A financing, we also got our first FDA clearance, which was actually in 2020. We press released it in 2021. This was the goal with that Series A cash, is use the FDA validation trial, build the distribution system, and then get FDA clearance so that we could go and actually commercialize the software. Which led us to our next funding round, which was Series B. We had an FDA cleared product. We're ready to commercialize it. So Series B, FDA clearance and initial customer adoption is important. Customer testimonials to say, we're using this product, we love it. A more robust commercial plan, things like revenue projections and having a strong leadership. By this point, it wasn't really, you know, I was still CEO, but a strong leadership team around me delivering the product. But it all went wrong in 2021. The guidelines suddenly changed for coronary artery disease. So echo no longer became the primary modality for measuring coronary artery disease. And this was right after we got our Series B funding. And what happened was essentially a big study came out, or multiple big studies came out and said that stents, what we know as stents, which treat coronary artery disease, were no longer more effective than just taking medical therapy, right? And so you don't need a diagnostic test really to put a patient on medical therapy, but you do need a diagnostic test to send patients for angiogram to have a stent because it's an invasive procedure. But for medical therapy, you just need to know the patient's risk factors, and it's fairly low risk, so you'll just start them on the therapy if they have coronary artery disease, which means that no one was being sent for stress echoes anymore. So our market for our product capitulated overnight. And yeah, in 2021, the guidelines changed and suggested that echo should no longer be, and stress echo in particular, should no longer be used, or at least it's not as high up in the guidelines. And yeah, what we saw was a volume decrease of echo. So we had to figure out what to do. And adding insult to injury, we were actually halfway through a prospective randomized controlled trial. It cost us $2 million to do. We were halfway through that when these guidelines changed. For anyone that knows cardiology, the European Society of Cardiology is our Glastonbury. It's the one that you want to get to. It's the one I've always dreamed of getting and presenting at. If you're at it's called the Hotline main stage at European Society of Cardiology. 30,000 cardiologists attend. And yeah, I got selected to go up and present this trial, but unfortunately the guidelines had changed halfway through the trial. So what I presented was essentially a neutral trial. There was no positive results. But my dream of always getting to that stage ended up in a bit of a disappointment or nightmare, as it were. So this trial ended up being neutral because, well, you could probably guess, we powered it on the number of people that would be referred to angiography, and with the guidelines change, about 50% of those never ended up getting referred. So we didn't have enough power to prove significance. So what did we do? We pivoted, like all good startups do when they get into trouble. We had to figure out how to pivot. And we decided to find a different disease area away from coronary artery disease, where there's no chance the guidelines would change against us. It'll be the mainstay for diagnosis, and that it's, you know, as impactful, even if not even more impactful than coronary artery disease. So we pivoted to heart failure. Heart failure is, well, it's kind of what it is, says on the tin. It's where your heart fails. But there's two ways of your heart failing. One is your pump fails. That's pretty easy to see on a visual video of an echocardiogram. You can see the pump failing. Next is not enough blood gets into the pump in the first place. That's a different form of heart failure, where you don't get enough blood in the first place. And this is a difficult one to diagnose, and it's the most common form of heart failure today. It's now overtaken the pump failing kind of heart failure. So we call this HFpEF, heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. And that means the pump works fine, but not enough blood gets into the pump to start with. So from now on, I'm going to call it HFpEF. So that's what I mean when I refer to HFpEF. And so we went through the diagnostic triangle with HFpEF. Did it fit the diagnostic triangle? Well, we undertook a literature review, and we saw that up to 64% of HFpEF patients are missed in clinic. So these are patients that are coming through, having echoes, and they're not being diagnosed. It's incredibly difficult to diagnose HFpEF. Moreover, heart failure, does it cause the big problem, the hospitalization problem? Yeah, it's the leading cause of hospitalization, and is projected to cost the US nearly $70 billion in hospitalizations by 2030. It's a huge, huge cost for the healthcare system. So it's misdiagnosed, and it's got a huge hospitalization problem. So that's 1 and 2 of the triangle. And number 3, does it have a therapy? Well, this was the thing that made this all worth it. HFpEF had never had a therapy available up until 2021. And in 2021, the first therapy got approved for HFpEF, which was called an SGLT2I inhibitor, that showed a risk reduction of heart failure hospitalizations by nearly 30%. It's a big breakthrough. Again, it was at the ESC on that stage, and I was in the audience for this one. And we felt that, yes, we've now got the triangle. That's the triangle complete. We can go after HFpEF as a diagnostic indication. So, you know, fast forward, a lot of pain and rebuilding, everything, all of that. We we ended up building echocardiography heart failure, which is a HFpEF diagnostic. But we also built a diagnostic to phenotype HFpEF, which is for cardiac amyloidosis, which is a deadly phenotype of heart failure. So we were able to build both of these products, critically increasing the sensitivity and specificity of the diagnosis of disease. Interestingly, we've spoken about HFpEF being a big problem on the diagnostic triangle. Amyloidosis causes about 10 to 20% of HFpEF is caused by amyloidosis. That is super deadly. So in the worst case scenario, if a patient has cardiac amyloidosis, they maybe live for 5 months, but there's therapies now available that can reduce their mortality significantly. So it's really important to find these patients. However, on average, it takes 5 echoes before they're even picked up. So these are patients that have a deadly disease that have 5 echoes before they're picked up. So often they're not even diagnosed, they just end up dying. So these are the 2 diagnostic indications we ended up building, and are the 2 main ones we have today. We extensively published the data on this, set up trials. Won't go through all of that again, but we set up trials. We published the data. What we saw in one of our main publications was that if you look at the bar chart there on the left-hand side, using a standard clinical practice risk score, potentially how they diagnose HFpEF today in clinic, they only picked up 40% of the cases in our trial that we did. And our AI algorithm was able to diagnose 93% of the cases. So you can see the big difference the algorithm made in that clinical trial. That was run over 8 different hospitals across 6 different states, plus a system here in the UK as well. And we also showed that not only could we find the patients, we actually found the patients at highest risk. The patients we found had a 3.5 times higher risk for hospitalizations. So we're finding these patients and we can get them on the therapy. The last piece, I won't really go into this too much, but it's really important when you're commercializing this technology to think about the return on investment to hospitals. This can either be a health economic return on investment, or it could be a reimbursement return on investment. And so what we did, US is our main commercial market. So we had to go out and get reimbursement. And that means that health insurers pay hospitals to use your technology. And so we were able to go and use that data that we showed on the previous slide to go and get reimbursement to pay for our product. Series C, which is kind of today, really, for the company. So where have we landed on Series C? So we've got multiple FDA clearances now. I think we've got 6 in total. I didn't go through all the clearances that we have, but we have about 6 FDA clearances in total. We have multiple reimbursement codes. We now have a proven commercial model and revenue growth, multiple validation papers, and multiple strategic partners too. So just revisiting my first slide in the talk, I said I was going to come back to this one. This was the kind of normalish looking echo. All the ejection fraction is normal, which means the pump is pumping normally. Nothing remarkable about these measurements, about this patient. And I'm just going to show you what happens when we delivered our reports back to the hospital. So this is the hospital PAC system, and these are our reports inside it. And what we could see is you had this patient was positive for amyloidosis and positive for HFpEF. So as I mentioned, in a worst case scenario with amyloidosis, this patient could die within 5 months. And this is the power of AI, right? It's able to find things in those pixels that rudimentary measurements or rudimentary observations can't see. And yeah, this is the clinical value, and this is where we are today. So right now, any hospital that plugs into our cloud kind of receives reports back. Looks exactly like this on the screen. And that's it. Happy to take any questions.
So the first one is, do you have any stratification in your data between men and women? Because I know the heart disease is actually very different.
Yeah, yeah, we do. So, with the FDA, they won't regulate your device unless you show that breakdown. It has to work equally across men and women, but also across ethnicities, different regions. And the diseases that we're focusing on, particularly HFpEF, is actually a more female dominant disease. And so we have to show it works, obviously equally as well in women as as it is in males. It's often missed. And I think, one of the reasons, particularly on this question, when a female comes in with kind of symptoms that may or may not be cardiac, I think the old kind of biased view of it from a doctor's point of view is it's likely not cardiac because it's a woman, whereas we know that's not the case. We know that women just present slightly differently, and you should have cardiac in front of mind when you're working up. And so that's one of the things that AI is good at, right? It's a level setter. If the doctor gets our report and pings them and say this patient has heart failure, it can help get over some of those predetermined biases that they had. And so that was really interesting. And in our neutral clinical trial that I presented at the European Society of Cardiology, one of the more positive findings in it was that actually in women, it did seem to have a much bigger effect. Even though there was low numbers, it did look to be beneficial in women, because cardiologists, again, I think generally have this preconceived bias that if a woman comes in with symptoms, it's probably not cardiac, which isn't true.
And the other thing is probably very silly, but it's my ignorance. So you at some point you were talking about the AI model and said it's probably too heavy. So it's just for me to understand. So I thought you had the hardware, and then on the hardware you install your model, which is a pre-trained model, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's data. So why do you say you need it, or do you consider having an external site? So do you train also continuously the model on data that come in from the hospital? So
yeah, it's a good question. So first of all, we don't have the hardware, so we have to use other people's hardware. If we have to work with whatever echocardiography machines the hospitals have and their storage systems. So we have to work with that. You can store we have got AI models working on the machines. They tend to take about a minute to run. And when you're in that kind of clinical workflow, it's a little bit too long. They want everything instantaneously, especially when you're using a bit of hardware, you want it instantaneously. And so it's better to run in the cloud where it can run faster and deliver back a report. So that's kind of the primary reason. And we're going to have multiple models. So if one takes 1 minute to run, they're all going to take progressively longer. In terms of, do we use data? So it's a tricky question. So, we ingest a lot of data from a lot of hospitals. We run about 300,000 patients through our AI models at the moment, which is about 10 million echo video clips in total. We've got a lot of data there. Problem is it's not labeled data, so we don't have the gold standard clinical outcome for those data. So the uses are, it's not as useful as having the gold standard labeled data. The other problem with constantly updating your AI model is the regulatory bodies don't allow you to do that. You have to have fixed models, and then if you want to update it, it's got to be another regulatory submission after that. I'm hoping there'll be guidelines in the future where you can update your models without having to do a full FDA submission, because it will allow quicker innovation. But it's one of the reasons why health tech is so slow versus just doing a consumer technology business, for example.
So that's really interesting. I really liked your phone wall. I was wondering whether you've given any thought to whether be a version of that used for other kinds of decision making around where AI would be useful.
Yeah, I think you can just swap out those things, right? So at the top, the thing at the top is, we call it, what's misdiagnosed, but it could be, what's causing the big problem. And then the thing on the right is, what is that problem leading to? Cost, money, time savings, whatever. And then the last leg of that triangle is, what do you do about it? So I think it's it's applicable to many different things.
But I think sort of drill into that a bit. So it's like, if you just say what is the big problem, already you've done some thinking. There's something that actually this is a problem to which AI is a useful approach.
Yeah.
So do you think there's something implicit? There obviously is something implicit in your thinking about this. How? Because I might say, well, inequality in bright is a big problem. That's means problems of AI. So what do you have any thoughts on what types of problem? Is there a
Look, yeah, I think it's a good question. So I think 24/7 about echo and AI and cardiology. So I think very little about anything else, to be honest. However, where that's come from is that I was in clinic, right? I was training, and the problem was staring me right in the face. And I was like, I know I can use AI, and my theory is I can use AI to solve this. And so I was experiencing it every day. So often when I work with other entrepreneurs, I try and get them to take the problems for which they see and are accustomed to. So it also makes a lot of hard stuff happens during this journey. And if you're uniquely positioned to solve those challenges, by experiencing the problem yourself, then it makes all of those decisions and all of this journey a lot easier. I think if, for example, someone that had an AI background that wanted to get into echo and went, oh, look, there's a problem. There's so much you don't know about echo and the clinical problem yourself. It's difficult to necessarily solve it. I think if you can take a problem that you're experiencing, that you're passionate about, and that you think AI can solve, I think that's probably the best way to go about it, in my personal opinion.
I was wondering, there must be other competitors that you would have with.
Yeah. Yeah, there always is competitors. I think when we started, we were kind of the only people in echo so it depends on how broad you want to cut the space. So in terms of echo diagnostics, so diagnostics for cardiac ultrasound, we're still the only one in the space. No one else has come up with an FDA cleared solution for it. However, they're coming. I see it all the time with academic papers coming out and people spinning out companies. There's loads of people coming into the space now. So we're going to deal a bit more with competition as we go forward, I think. But for the last 7-8 years, we've been in a bit of a nice space where we were first to market, and we're able to kind of capitalize on that. I think the reason we didn't have competitors to start with is, again, you're starting from first principles on a problem. You're not going, oh, look, there's a cold technology, how can I do that better or faster or cheaper? You're going, this is the problem, how do I solve it? And then when you start from there, you have to create an entirely new piece of technology to do that. And if you do that, you're not going to have competitors, at least initially. When you start making PR and noise and stuff, they'll come eventually, which is what we're finding now. But it's a good thing because it means you've built something useful if other people want to try and come in and come into the space.
I think she was right. One technical question. So, when you provide some measure on certain. Yes.
Yeah, so we did use an ensemble back in the day. We don't do that anymore. We've gone to straight pipeline of convolutional neural network pipeline. So the actual diagnostic algorithm now is a 3D neural network that has been trained against a gold standard outcome that predicts the disease. It was slightly more powerful than in terms of diagnostic accuracy than just feeding features into an ensemble. However, it becomes less explainable, which can be an issue clinically. What we do is we output a probability score. So, what essentially it's like a likelihood score. So our probability score is supposed to represent, out of all the data your AI has seen, what percentage of patients had the disease within your data set. So if it was a 0.7 score, 70% of the patients had the disease in your data set. If it was 0.9, 90% of the patients had disease. So when someone sends a study in and gets the probability score back, that's kind of what it means. We also output an uncertainty score as well, but the customers haven't taken to that one yet as a feature that they like. They're happy with the probability score. The uncertainty score they're not quite sure what to do, partly because probability and uncertainty are quite correlated. So they often come out relatively similar. So explainability, though, is still a big thing that we're trying to work on as a field, but also in Ultromics, we're trying to figure out how to make these black box models more explainable. There are things like GradCams and stuff out there that are probably fairly useless, but hopefully in the future we'll come up with more explainable. But there is also a school of thought to say, if you validated the product really, really well, do you need to explain it? Like if it's robust clinical validation, do you need to explain it? And there's many drugs out there that are approved, they're guidelined, category 1, that we don't know how they work. They just work and they're validated to work. So yeah, I think it's an interesting debate.
Without particular private. So, disease like therapy. It's good builds. The model one.
It's a good question. I think, one of the reasons for the triangle is if you hit on all those 3 points, I think every stakeholder you eventually end up selling to gets value out of it, which is, the triangle, although we first came up with the idea during the PhD, it really kind of solidified when we spin out, because you need to build something that someone's going to buy, which means that it needs to deliver value. And so that's kind of what's in the triangle, right? So if you're just capturing, just use my example, if you're just capturing a disease that's misdiagnosed, that's great, right? But if there's no therapy for it, it's difficult to convince someone to buy the technology. It's more of a practical concern. Likewise, if there is a therapy, but it's a therapy that doesn't fix a big problem, again, that's difficult. So with HFpEF, you can just do the math, which is there's a 64% misdiagnosis. If you take that down to just 5% misdiagnosis, you're capturing a lot of patients. all of that misdiagnosis was contributing to the hospitalization problem, which was costing 70 billion in the US, right? And there's a therapy that can reduce that problem by 30%. Everyone wins in that equation, which is the reason for the triangle. It's not, I wouldn't necessarily use a triangle if I was just trying to build a diagnostic model that I wasn't looking to necessarily sell, that I was looking to open source or just do for the good of humanity, get it out there. I think the triangle is probably not necessary, but if you're looking to actually build a company and get someone to buy the product, I think you have to have those elements of the triangle. And what I like about the triangle is it aligns, you know, what's good for the patient, what's good for healthcare systems, with actually being able to get someone to buy it as well.
Thanks, Rob. I was really early on, you were talking about the fact that the software works better with these less experienced clinicians and the more experienced clinicians. I wonder whether that was the same with the later, I think that was the first trials that you were talking about, and also following on from that, whether you think that there's any sort of long-term sort of effect in terms of Westwood. Speculative in terms of the answering software, in terms of what that will be in terms of the kind of development experience of the kind of clinicians as they go through.
What software was that? Like,
It's the software. I suppose at the moment what you're saying is that it's more effective
with
when you've got less experienced clinician. Will the less experienced clinicians become learn to it? I suppose that maybe that goes to the explainability. It's not explainable. Will they develop in the same way, do you think? I mean, I don't know in terms of what.
Yeah, I think it was certainly true with the coronary artery disease diagnostic. It certainly helped the lesser experienced clinicians a lot more, and we saw that across every trial we did. With these ones, these diseases are just missed so often that I'm sure more experienced clinicians are slightly better, but they just, I mean, they're more missed than they are picked up often, especially amyloidosis. So I think we've gone for diseases now where just across the board, the diagnostic baseline accuracy is abysmal. And yeah, so, you know, I hope, and what we're seeing is that actually one of the most powerful things about what we do here, what we're seeing in clinic is that just the prompt. They're not even diseases that they're necessarily thinking of, right? So it's not even in their mind. So the fact an AI that you hooked up to an AI system that just flashes up and says, this is amyloidosis. Yeah, like if you get one of these reports back in your PAC system with a big red box saying, this is amyloidosis, you know, suddenly the clinician's going to go, oh my goodness, I wasn't even thinking about it. So it wasn't even top of mind. So, you know, I think going for either rare diseases or massively underdiagnosed diseases is quite a good one, because it's not even generally a diagnosis they're even necessarily thinking of. Exactly. So any improvement actually is better because they're not even thinking about it. As I said, with amyloid, average amount of echoes before a patient's picked up is 5. So like 5 echoes before they're even diagnosed. So it's just you know, people just aren't seeing it or even thinking about it.
Any other questions? Okay, let's thank Ross again.
Yeah.